The last video for this week is going to focus on the sexual cycle, the ovulation cycle, the menstrual cycle, which all go hand in hand. So the sexual cycle averages 28 days. That's the average in women, but can vary from 20 to 45, and are regulated by hormones of the hypothalamus. That regulates the pituitary, and then those hormones regulate the ovaries, and then ovaries secrete hormones that regulate the uterus. So that kind of gives you a hierarchy of the hormonal control right there. But ovaries exert feedback control over the hypothalamus and pituitary. They're sending messages back when it's time to slow down the hormonal secretion. So let's take a look at the breakdown of the cycle. The cycle begins with a 2-week follicular phase, and the menstruation occurs during the first 3 to 5 days of the cycle. The first day of menstruation is the first day of the cycle. The uterus replaces the lost tissue by mitosis, and then new follicles are growing. The ovulation, where the egg is released, is occurring at day 14, usually for most people. And then the remainder of the follicle becomes corpus luteum, and we'll talk about that. From there, the next 2 weeks are called the luteal phase, and the corpus luteum stimulates endometrial secretion and thickening. And then if pregnancy doesn't occur, then the endometrium breaks down in the last 2 days, then the menstruation begins and the cycle starts all over again. So let's look at ovarian cycle within that sexual cycle. So we see the follicle phase, the ovulation, and then the luteal phase. So this reflects what's happening just in the ovaries. But again, we don't know a whole lot about this timing of the development of the follicles. There is quite a bit that is still a mystery. So the follicle phase extends from the beginning of menstruation until ovulation, so day 1 to 14 of an average cycle. So the pre-ovulatory phase is from the end of menstruation until ovulation. That's the most variable part, so we can't really use that to predict the date of ovulation. But the preparation for the follicular phase begins almost 2 months earlier. So shortly after ovulation, a new group of follicles descends from the cortex and starts to grow and develop. The ovaries alternate, which ovary is releasing the egg. So that's why it's talking about 2 months. Because your right ovary will release the egg, and then that cycle will start over, and then the left ovary, and back and forth. So the selection window of 5 days, in which one of them is selected as the dormant follicle to mature and eventually ovulate in the next cycle. The hormone FSH stimulates the continued growth of those follicles, but especially the dominant follicle gets the most growth. And then the cells also, and the dominant follicle becomes more sensitive to the hormones and eventually grows and matures, just like we talked about in the previous video. And this kind of shows, along with the pictures, how the hormone levels are. That's a much better picture of a tertiary follicle, and then the follicle during ovulation when essentially bursts and releases the egg. And so that you can see right there that ovulation point, just before that was kind of the highest points or the highest point of LH. Ovulation is where the mature follicle ruptures and the egg is released, typically around day 14. Again, it's different for different people. We have a surge of LH and a lesser spike of FSH by the anterior pituitary. And that high level of LH kind of starts several events. It starts that primary oocyte to finish meiosis 1. It has the secondary oocyte and the first polar body, which again, we worked through that in the last video. And then finally the mature follicle approaches rupture. So all of that is brought on by this surge of LH. I would definitely encourage you to go through each of these animations. And let's move on to the post-ovulatory phase, day 15 to 28, just after ovulation, and then all the way to the beginning or the onset of menstruation. If pregnancy doesn't occur, then the following is going to happen. When the follicle ruptures, it's going to collapse and bleed into the antrum, which is that fluid-filled space. The clotted blood is going to be absorbed, and then the cells multiply and fill the antrum, and then a bed of capillaries is going to grow there. And then this is where we have a follicle, or those cells now become the corpus luteum. It's named for a yellow lipid that accumulates there, and so those cells are now called lutein cells. This just talks about how that transformation from the ruptured follicle to those luteum cells is regulated by LH. It talks about a spike in progesterone is the most important aspect of this phase. It can have a crucial role in preparing the uterus for the possibility of pregnancy. Remember, that last series of events is what happens if we don't get pregnant, but really the body has to be ready for either option. So the high amount of progesterone needs to be ready for preparing the uterus. And then the LH and FSH are going to decline for the rest of the cycle. So the corpus luteum is going to start to shrink at about day 22. By 26, the shrinkage is complete and becomes an inactive bit of scar tissue. And then the FSH levels are going to rise, and that's kind of getting a new group of follicles. And again, the ovaries alternate from month to month. So right side, left side. Okay, let's talk about specifically the menstrual cycle and what happens. That was kind of just looking at the ovaries, and let's now just look at the uterus. So the endometrium is built up during most of the sexual cycle, but then it is broken down and released. This gives 4 phases. Again, I'm not really picky that you know all these phase names, but just kind of the process altogether. So we would expect the first day of menstruation is day 1 of the sexual cycle. For most people, the average is 5 days. I shouldn't say most people. The average is 5 days. So the beginning is the layer of endometrial tissue that is lost. When it is lost, it is then rebuilt. So after day 5 of menstruation, the endometrium is very thin. It's 0.5 millimeters thick. It is only that stratum basalis, which is that lowest layer, and it's able to rebuild from there. By day 14, it is 2 to 3 millimeters thick, and has rebuilt in not 2 weeks, in 1 week, week and a half. So then in the secretory phase, the endometrium thickens from day 15 to day 26. Doesn't thicken from mitosis, it thickens from secretion and fluid accumulation. The glands grow wider, longer, and more coiled, and so it can get to 5 to 6 millimeters thick. This is a nice, nutritious bed for embryonic development. Okay, and then after that is the premenstrual phase, the period where the endometrial layer is going to degenerate. It's the last 2 days of the cycle, and so everything kind of the blood flow is interrupted to this endometrium, I should say. This is what brings tissue necrosis and our menstrual cramps. And so the blood accumulates and the stratum functionalis. And then the endometrium mixes with the blood and the serous fluid, and all of that together is considered menstrual fluid. So the menstrual phase then is the discharge of menstrual fluid from the vagina. The first day of discharge is day 1 of the new cycle. An average woman would expect to expel 40 milliliters of blood, 35 milliliters of serous fluid over a 5-day period. It contains a protein, so it does not clot, even though sometimes it feels like it. And then this just takes a look at those hormone levels on the top, and then kind of what the endometrium looks like throughout all of the phases in the sexual cycle. Again, I know there's a lot more in your book, but we are going to end the female reproductive system here.